Well, we've reached our third input, and you'll find that it's quite different from the two we have already gone through. This time we're looking at religious experience and empirical research. It's a fascinating subject, but it's very detailed. In recent years, a number of books have come out written by people like de Quilly, Newberg and Alper, and they're engaging in what is known as neurotheology. It's a new subject. Sometimes it's known as biotheology, but it's a study of the brain to see, is there part of the brain that makes religious experience possible? And scientists have been investigating the cortex to see, can they precisely locate the part of the brain that is registering religious experience. If I can just say as a little tangent, a few years ago, Channel 4 television asked me would I participate in a program over in London where they were intending to examine a man who was going to be exorcised. And there were many scientists in the studio. I remember there was one man that I talked to quite a bit from Oxford University, and he was involved in the study of the brain. And they had all kinds of wires onto this poor man, and they were going to register how did his brain react when he was undergoing the exorcism. Now, there was one fault in the whole thing. He didn't need an exorcism. And I remember saying to the man who was running the program, when he asked me, well, what do you think about this? And I said, well, I think it's going to be a bit of a flop because the man who's going to be exorcised does not need one, and therefore nothing's going to register on your machines. And that turned out to be the case, by the way. So it was a damp squib. But it's this notion that if you have an experience, it should register in the brain. And if you have a religious experience, does that register in a peculiar way in the brain? Now, there are a number of people who have done pioneering research in this area. And the first one I want to mention is a Canadian neuropsychologist called Michael Persinger. And he did his pioneering work in the 1990s. Now, this will sound utterly bizarre, but he made a hat-like magnetic stimulator and he put it on his own head. And this hat beamed rapidly fluctuating magnetic fields at selected areas of his brain, specifically the temporal lobes, that is the areas of the brain just under your forehead. And as a result of the magnetic stimulation, Persinger says that he saw God. I don't think he literally saw him with his eyes, but he experienced God. Subsequently, he found that he could induce all kinds of religious experiences, such as out-of-the-body experiences, mystical experiences, by stimulating appropriate parts of the brain. So he was arguing there is a part of the brain that makes religious experience possible. That was only initial research. Another scientist who's interesting in this regard is a man who is Indian, Vilya Anur Ramachandran, who works in San Diego University. I think that's in California. And back in 1998, he published a book entitled Phantoms in the Brain. And in it, he maintained that following seizures, about 25%, in other words, a quarter of all epileptics, reported having deeply moving spiritual experiences. They included a feeling of a divine presence and a sense of direct communication with God. Everything apparently around them was imbued with cosmic significance, kind of a halo effect. They said such things as, I finally understand what it's all about. Suddenly, it all makes sense. I have insight into the true nature of the universe. In the novel The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Prince Mishkin, who is an epileptic, says, I have really touched God. He came into me, myself. Yes, God exists, I cried. You all healthy people can't imagine the happiness which we epileptics feel during the second before our attack. Now, as a result of examining the epileptics who reported such significant religious experiences, Ramachandran and other researchers have suggested that there appears to be a capacity for religious experience in the front left temporal lobes. Briefly put, they suspect that epileptic seizures cause damage to some of the pathways which connect the area of the brain that deals with sensory information to the amygdala, which gives such information emotional significance. As a result, these patients can perceive an unusual depth of spiritual meaning in every object and event. Jeffrey Saver and John Rabin of the University of California in Los Angeles, in the Neurological Research Center, have suggested that the available documentary evidence indicates that a number of the world's spiritual leaders suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy. The tentative list would include people such as the prophet Ezekiel, the apostle Paul, Muhammad, and Joan of Arc. Not surprisingly, scientists like Persinger and Ramachandran have referred to the part of the brain that facilitates religious experience as the God spot or the God module. See, so what they are suggesting is that our brains are hardwired for religious experience. What are we to make of all of this? The role of the temporal lobes in religious experience of epileptics probably throws light on the way in which all of us can have such experiences. However, non-believers such as Professor Susan Greenfield, who's English, and who some time ago presented a fascinating series about the brain on TV, maintained that awareness of God is merely the outcome of the complex activities of the temporal lobes of the brain. In other words, rather than being God's creation, the brain is the creator of God experiences. This is typical of the reductionist approach of some scientists. I can say, however, that I read an article in The Tablet where Professor Greenfield was interviewed, and she said that she was going on retreats and that she was looking for God and that she was more open now to the possibility that rather than being a creation of the brain, God is the one who created the brain, and that there is an objectively existing God. It's worth noting also that when eminent neuroscientist Andrew Newberg was asked whether the brain created the idea of God or God created the brain, he responded, "Neuroscience can't answer that question." And I think he's correct, because you can't give empirical answers to metaphysical questions. Now we move on to a more down-to-earth element of research. In the 20th century, a number of researchers looked at religious experience from an empirical point of view. For example, Alistair Hardy was born in 1896, and he became an a zoologist, a very eminent one. And in 1925, he went to the Antarctic to do research. But before he headed off, he paid an agency in England to gather quotations about religion from the papers. And he said that he would collect them when he returned. Now, when he got back to England, he was disappointed with the results. Much later, in 1948, when he was a professor at Oxford, Hardy gave a lecture which once again raised the religious issue. He said, "When some of the leading biologists proclaim a mechanistic, a materialistic interpretation of life, they find their faith in science in conflict with an intuition which speaks to them of spiritual reality. One or other of them must be an illusion. Which is it? I am sure that the answer to that question is far more important to mankind than the discovery of atomic power." In 1951, in the course of a lecture entitled "Science and the Quest for God," Hardy suggested that there was a need for a special institute to study religious experience. Sometime later, he was invited to give 2 series of the Gifford Lectures. And sometime later, he retired from his professorship and decided to set up the Religious Research Unit in Manchester College, Oxford. I may say, for those who are interested, that currently this institute is situated in Lampeter University in Wales. And that university, by the way, have a very interesting website which contains many articles free to download that might interest those of you who are attending these lectures. Hardy began to collect material by putting an ad in the paper asking for accounts of religious experience. And he provided examples of what he had in mind. There was a quotation from Beatrice Webb, the co-founder of the Fabian Society, and it went as follows: "For my part, I find it best to live as if the soul of man were in communion with a superhuman force which makes for righteousness." And he included a second quotation, a longer one, from a Hibbert lecture delivered by a man called L.P. Jacks back in 1922. I think he belonged to the Unitarian faith, by the way. He had said, quote, "All religious testimony, so far as I can interpret its meaning, converges towards a single point, namely this: there is that in the world, call it what you will, which responds to the confidence of those who trust it, declaring itself to them as a fellow worker in the pursuit of the eternal values, meeting their loyalty to it with reciprocal loyalty to them, and coming in at critical moments when the need of its sympathy is greatest. The conclusion being that wherever there is a soul in darkness, obstruction or misery, there is also a power which can help deliver, illuminate, and gladden the soul." Unquote. It seems a long way of describing what in AA they refer to as the higher power. Now, Hardy asked, had the readers ever been conscious of and perhaps influenced by a power, whether they called it the power of God or not? This power might either appear to be beyond their individual selves or in part outside and inside their being. If the readers had such an experience, they were asked to write to Hardy about it, describing the experience and its effects. Of course, Hardy got hundreds, if not thousands, of responses. And when he assessed all the information he had received, he wrote a book. I must say I found it a very fascinating book about his findings. It was entitled The Spiritual Nature of Man, a Study of Contemporary Religious Experience, which was published by the Oxford University Press. In typical scientific fashion, he tried to classify the available material under 12 different headings. Much of the book is devoted to explaining each category while providing concrete examples drawn from the many responses he received. And then a few years later, two women, Meg Maxwell and Verena Tushedin, gathered representative examples of religious experience and published them in a book entitled Seeing the Invisible, Modern Religious and Other Transcendent Experiences. I must say, I found that a fascinating book to read. In the 1970s and 80s, David Hay of the Alistair Hardy Research Centre, I know he is a Catholic, did similar research in England. He asked Hardy's question, have you ever been conscious of a presence or power, whether you call it God or not, which is different from your everyday self? And when all the responses were examined, it was found that 35% of the respondents said yes. So this indicated that religious experience wasn't necessarily tied to church going. Hay, who was later the head of the Alistair Hardy Research Centre for a few years, was teaching science at Nottingham University at the time. And he decided to do an in-depth survey on 172 of his students on the campus. And besides using a questionnaire, he interviewed each respondent. And the results were really surprising. Because although many of the young men and women who were interviewed didn't go to church services and weren't ostensibly religious at all, as many as 62% of them said that they had had religious experience. That came, I know, as a big surprise to David Hay. In 1973, across the Atlantic, Andrew Greeley and a man called McCready of the National Opinion Research Centre, Chicago, asked a sample of people whether they ever had had an ecstatic type religious experience. And surprise, surprise, 35% responded that they had, which was almost identical to the English figures. In 1978, Princeton Religious Research Center, a subsidiary of Gallup polls, confirmed the Chicago figures. It asked the following question in interviews: how often have you felt as though you were very close to a powerful spiritual force that seemed to lift you out of yourself? Again, about 35% of the replies said that they had had such an experience once or more than once. So when one looks at the research done on both sides of the Atlantic in recent years, it indicates that at least 1/3 of the population have had a significant religious experience. And many of those who have had such experiences were not churchgoers, and a surprisingly high proportion of those who reported such experiences were men, because we don't think of men as being as religious as women. In fact, in some surveys, they constituted a small majority. In the year 2000, David Hay and Kate Hunt published the most recent research findings in an article entitled, "Is Britain's Souls Waking Up?" It was published on the 24th of June 2000. And in it, they said that paradoxically, as institutional religion declined in Britain, the number of people reporting that they had had a religious experience had doubled to around 66%, 2/3 of the population. I remember Hayes saying and Hunt saying in that article that there was literally an explosion in Britain of people being interested in spiritual things. But they pointed out that because they were not churchgoers, and by the way, current research shows that over half of the British population say they have no religion and no church affiliation of any kind. But even though that is the case, and many people are searching for spiritual meaning, and Hay and Hunt said the problem they had, though, was they had no language in which to express their experience because they'd lost touch with all the traditional religious language. And they said if they did express themselves in verbal terms, it was largely in terms of New Age spirituality because it was accessible and they were borrowing language from New Age in order to express what they were experiencing. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this kind of research I mean on religious experience, has not been done in Ireland. Now, it have to be said, of course, that for many years, Ireland has participated in the European Values Report, which is a survey that's done all over the continent, or at least the EU countries, into what people value and believe. And there is a section which is published every few years on each individual country, including Ireland, of course. And it includes a section containing statistics about religious beliefs and practices. Of course, that's all about the externals of religion. However, it doesn't deal specifically with the subject of religious experience. Now, the European Value Systems reports indicate that a fairly significant proportion of people still think that God and religion are important in their lives. But we do not know what correlation there is, if any, with the incidence of religious experience. And I know at one stage I was thinking of doing a doctorate on this subject because I thought it was so important. And I was hypothesizing that to practice your religion would make it less likely to have religious experience, which would be a rather heretical point of view. And that not to be practicing your religion would make it more likely that you would have religious experience. Quite honestly, I don't know what the answer is. It's an answer which can only be established by doing empirical research. Suffice it to say that for anyone who would undertake such a piece of research, a good PhD is waiting to be gained, and a very relevant one as well. Now, empirical research has indicated that a surprisingly large percentage of the population in the secularized English-speaking countries report having had religious experiences. But I've said a lot of the time they're not related to religious practice or to orthodox religious beliefs. Neuroscientists have discovered that part of the brain which is hardwired to make such experiences possible does exist. And one of the observations that I would like to make before I end is to say Just as the eyes can see an objectively existing world, and the ears can hear objectively existing sounds, and the nostrils can smell objectively existing odors, and the sense of touch can feel objectively existing surfaces, so I believe that the areas of the brain which are hardwired for religious experience can get in touch with objectively existing transcendental realities. To suggest otherwise, as Professor Greenfield and others have said, seems like an unjustifiable a priori prejudice to me.